Planet Vita Nova, a terrestrial body with a variety of environmental biomes, was settled by humanity during the Age of Technology and the Great Diaspora. But much like other settlements of the time, they were cut off from the rest of humanity at the eruption of the Eye of Terror and the beginning of the Age of Strife. For most of the colony's existence thereafter, the planet's resources held, and the civilization thrived in spite of no communication or support. Leaning heavily into science and logic, the culture continued with their beliefs in the aforementioned era and perished with technological and other human genetic development. Using the STC system still available, the settlers of Vita Nova were able to further expand, enhance, and develop new means of scientific production, reproduction, and genetic enhancement. From marvelous industrial machines to large robotics, the scientifically minded Novae, new settlers, seemed on track to rival any force amongst the stars. With such magnificent technologies at their disposal, the Novae needed for nothing, and the population exploded. Medical miracles and production enabled the population of Vita Nova to not only live well, but long past traditional expenditure. With drastically reduced disease, eliminated chronic pain and illness, and enhancements to the human body to such an intense degree, those living in this age could have been considered superhuman in their own right. However, with nearly every one of the population engaging in such technological or genetic enhancement, there was a fairly consistent level of a normalized human supremacy. After several millennia, the entire planet was explored, developed, and subsequently stripped of nearly all the natural resources, turning the bright green and blue sphere into a dull orange as forests became deserts. Once lush jungles and rivers slowly turned to dust and ash as the Nova extracted the life of Vita Nova. Despite the immense scientific development of the Novae, their population was too great and their efforts too late for the artificial resources of the great cities to maintain the status quo. Subsistence hoarding began as wasteland became more common than fertile growth. Food and water soon ran scarce, and outbreaks of violent protest and riots steadily became the norm. Security enforcement became stretched and fatigued as they battled every day to maintain order and distribute what supplies were available. With such a well-equipped and heavily enhanced population, this was a near impossible task as the criminal elements sought to take advantage of the dwindling faith in government and reduction of subsistence means. The fight to contain the offenders placed an even greater strain on the already overworked supply lines, exacerbating an ever-worsening issue. Whole companies of enforcement troops were quickly becoming insufficient to combat the growing criminal elements. An ever-growing black market rose, bleeding into open street violence as the corrupt elements became increasingly more emboldened. Clandestine criminal operations became overt attacks against security or anyone not a member of their crew. Struggling to keep up with the enforcement arms race, various security personnel turned to an increasing level of response, sometimes becoming more brutal to the public and offenders than even the criminals themselves. With violent crime at its peak and enforcement unruly, the civilization seemed ready to completely collapse as the Republic of Vita Nova government was at a loss for viable solutions. The planet was at the brink. Because of overpopulation, dwindling supplies, and uncontrolled street violence, a rebellion began. From the ground level, the citizens started to rise, and in a mere instant, the shots of war rang out. Two factions were formed, both fighting over the scraps of the planet, and both equal in dominance, the many versus the elite. Initially, it was the highly armed and enhanced common citizen against the increasing authoritarian government and its equally enhanced enforcers. The feud caused a great civil war as more and more factions divided and joined a side. Called The Reckoning, the war demolished an already dying world. Fields of sand turned to glass under the pressure of warring regions. With such peak levels of human and technological development put toward war-making, nearly half of the entire population was wiped out in a few short years. Whole cities leveled to the ground so that they could be scrapped for materials by the victor who killed them. Within less than a decade, nearly all the progress the Novae had made over millennia, all their struggles, hopes, and dreams, gone. Along with the genocide of their own people, much of their more advanced technology was destroyed, lost forever. Conflict seemed to rage over every inch of Vita Nova. Great machines, superior soldiers, and futile acts of heroism conquered the globe. Every manner of weapon imaginable was used to great effect, crushing virtually all aspects of the once amazing civilization. Augmented battlesuits and powered, armored mechs, tanks, aerial attack fighters, bombers, all of numerous design, rained hell on the desperate fate of the planet. It seemed, no matter how advanced man became, war was an ever-present part of his nature. Over the next few centuries, the two factions continued fighting at an ever-present stalemate, each side losing more with every engagement and each faction losing sight of the conflict's initiation. Only the taut understanding of hatred for the other now fueled the reckoning. However, as time forged on and the majority of the population eliminated and slowly recovering, the massive drain of the renewable resources lifted, allowing for the replenishing of the life-supporting ecosystem. Much of this gradual returning life had gone unnoticed by the factions as their attention rested upon the continued destruction of their enemy. Whole battles and clashes were fought amongst the pockets of rushing wheat fields, completely oblivious to their surroundings, the blood of ignorance, fertilizer for an unrecognized future. As time continued, the dispute began to subside. Large battles turned to border skirmishes, resource conflicts became negotiations, and with each subsequent generation more and more of the population struggled less each season as life returned. Both factions, unbeknownst to each other, began implementing great conservation efforts to protect and support the returning wealth and ecosystem. Massive infrastructure was established to reclaim and recycle the abandoned remnants of the continuing but stagnated war. While the essence of Vita Nova sprang back against the destruction, the Novi lifestyle would never be the same. Despite making great gains in reclamation and agriculture, too much of the advanced technologies of the previous era would never be recovered or reproduced. Eventually, both factions agreed to a ceasefire and full reconstruction began for the respective sides. Technology that was regained was primarily put towards enhancing conservation efforts and development for a more renewable and sustainable environment. As new methods were discovered, they were also shared with the opposite faction to establish further trust and cooperation. With more resources now available for both sides, the war was eventually ended, and while the two factions remained segregated for a time, the conflict was over. The planet and the people were healing once again together. Realizing that the devastation of the planet and their civilization was caused by overpopulation and poor resource management, the two sides came to an agreement. In order to maintain healthy population levels and resource control, the differing sides would create a game of attrition in which each faction would send 25% of their adult population randomly selected to the Contest Resplendent every century on the anniversary of the peace treaty. Colloquially called the Great Game or the Contest, the Contest Resplendent consisted of live combat to the last man in 3 separate engagements over 3 24-hour periods. The contest was considered as much a commemoration of the reckoning as it was a blood sport. To conduct the contest, any section of Vita Nova not yet reclaimed would be designated combat arenas, fully stocked and supported for large, medium or small-scale engagements. The first action was called the Reckoning Remembered, and is a great army battle in which both sides organized their troops into functional regiments complete with tanks, mechs and supporting landing or assault aircraft. These regiments were then tasked with rushing to capture a designated strategic point located at the center of a large area chosen by both factions. Whichever army captured and held the point by the end of the 24-hour engagement would be granted victor. The fight would end and the survivors would be awarded a 1-hour lead for the next phase of the game. For the second engagement, the remaining fighters would then be broken down into smaller combat units or kill teams. These fire teams would be randomly dropped from aircraft onto a designated island to hunt down and eliminate as many other teams as possible before the end of the 24-hour time frame. Once on the ground, the teams would need to scavenge for pre-placed weapons and supplies to aid them in their hunt. The team that survives with the most eliminations at the end of the engagement would be granted additional weapons and war gear for the final phase. Finally, with the majority of contestants eliminated, the remaining warriors are sent to a large enclosed section of an island where they have to race against time to kill every other fighter in free-for-all combat. They will have one last day to become the last man standing. However, with every passing hour, larger and larger sections of the area are flooded with poisoned gas, electrified or filled with radioactive material, forcing those still alive to a final confrontation. With each successful kill, combatants are gifted additional items with more weapons and ammo, medical aid, or even the ability to have the controllers of the arena outright target another fighter with guided aerial munitions. Eventually, only one warrior will be the ultimate victor. Their prize, anointment as Rex Bellator, the Warrior King, supreme ruler of Vita Nova and bringer of peace between divisions. Over the next several centuries, the inclusion of the Great Game caused a dramatic shift in the culture of Vita Nova. Even with a renewed focus on peace, the population of the planet began pursuing an increase in their war and combat capabilities. Every citizen of Vita Nova became a soldier who one day hoped to test their skills in participation of the contest. It became a source of pride to become the greatest amongst them as the Rex Bellator, something all sought to become. Not content to wait for the Centennial Contest, a series of smaller, less lethal combat sports were created to satiate their want for competition. These smaller contests, however, were well diverse with a myriad of prizes. Some focused on martial skill, while others set high standards of marksmanship or vehicular combat. Some were just to push the bounds of fear and bravery in pure adrenaline challenges. Many of these contestants became celebrities as their games were broadcast over multiple pick feeds across the planet. Some remained local, others global, all relishing the chance to be drawn for the Great Game. Those warrior pick heroes who do manage to draw into the contest resplendent are often the chosen favorites to take ultimate victory. With their cultural focus now on combat in all forms, their technological development was redirected towards creating new tools of war. A mix of both lethal and non-lethal weapons were created. All manners of vehicles, armor, and terrain transversal equipment were developed, and with each generation more diverse combat techniques were formed. While the inhabitants of Vita Nova never truly revitalized their former glory, they made astonishing headway in military and agricultural growth. When not actively training for the contest, every Nova was dedicated towards subsistence production in agrarian or pastoral farming. Or they committed themselves to regaining their old scientific advances and continued environmental conservation. After nearly 10 millennia, the planet's balance between population control and resources held strong, and the civilization flourished once again. The two factions eventually became one with the influences of the Rex Bellator, and their warrior culture became a unified force. It was at this time that a lost fleet of the Tau Empire suddenly arrived in orbit above Vita Nova. The Tau had been a part of an expeditionary flotilla that were cast through space while using the Startide Nexus during the appearance of a random warp storm. Originally destined for the Narrated atoll on a reconnaissance mission, they emerged into real space near the planet Vita Nova. The spontaneous eruption of corrupted energy caused numerous vessels within the fleet to sustain moderate damage to many of their systems, including life support and navigation. With damaged systems and mass confusion, the Tau fleet needed a safe harbor to repair and resupply. After several scans of the system, it was determined that Vita Nova was the only viable planet that had the necessary resources needed to repair. Unbeknownst to the Tau, however, the planet already had caretakers. Initially, the Tau sent representatives from their watercaste to negotiate terms once it was discovered that the planet was already populated with a sophisticated civilization. The advanced party from the fleet brought conditions they believed optimal for both sides. The population of Vita Nova would join the Tau as part of the greater good, and their fleet would be allowed to settle the planet. The Tau would incorporate the Novae and share some of their technology to them in exchange for a controlling portion of their resources. However, with resources so heavily valued by the Novae, the Rex Bellator simply stated, "We share when you pay tribute," and asked for the Tau to send 25% of their entire fleet through the contest resplendent. After being informed of the nature of the contest, the Tau were appalled and offended, rejecting the offer. Believing themselves technologically superior, it was decided that if they were to lose 25% of any Tau, it would be on their own terms. Running out of time and with nowhere else to go, the Tau invaded. The invasion went as planned initially, but would soon take a dire turn as fire warriors began their assaults. Within hours of beginning the ground attacks, battalions of fire warriors were met head-on with the entire population of Novae warriors, many of which utilizing tactical assault packs, TAPs, a personal VTOL kit designed for fast attack units and scouts. These TAP units, too small to be targets for aircraft and anti-aircraft weapons, quickly overwhelmed entire companies of fire warriors, routing many of the forward lines. Once the main fronts were falling back, the Novae unleashed their full might. Mech after mech floated and ran onto the battlefield, matching the strength and speed of many Tau battlesuits. Shocked by the sudden fury, the Tau were forced to fall back and regroup. It was then that the Novae opened up with their artillery. Many variations of tank, both hover and tread, thundered out with heavy weapons, their barrels blazing with all manners of energy weapons or shell, shredded the clustered Tau forces. Finally, Titan scale mechs and walkers crashed into the crumbling lines of the Tau. Even though the Novae had launched an array of tank, flyer and walker, many of which stood toe-to-hoof with their Tau counterparts, losses were still incurred. But the Novae glorified loss in battle if it meant preserving their way of life. And so, with every loss they took, it was seen as an honorable death and was glorious to finally compete against a worthy foe besides themselves. For every Novae downed in combat, their excitement grew, encouraging and empowering them. In less than a day, the Tau had to call down all their reserves from the orbiting fleet. In under a week, they were surrendering to the Rex Bellator and his Novae warriors. With total victory at hand, the Rex Bellator made a final offer to the remaining Tau. For granting them the gift of real and meaningful combat, the Novae would allow the Tau to integrate into the Novae warrior society, and they have already paid their tribute, willingly or unwillingly. As many losses occurred on both sides, the balance of the planet would be maintained. The Tau, with little choice, vowed to cast away the greater good and became Novae, the new settlers. From then on, the original Novae and the Tau would be allowed to live and become Novae warriors, counting their offspring in the census for the Great Games. The technology would be absorbed and incorporated, their ships converted to the glory of Vita Nova. No longer Tau by culture, they were granted the same rights and privileges as any Novae. Over the next 2 centuries, their two groups would forget their differences outside of appearance and would develop and grow together. While unable to procreate directly, the Tau and human Novae still developed interspecies relationships. However, their inability to have offspring led to a new subculture of adoption of Tau and human children orphaned by the games. Upon the arrival of the next contest resplendent, the now fully integrated Tau would not hesitate to join and relished in its practice. Seeking only balance and honorable combat, the Novae warriors would never seek conquest of world, choosing instead to isolate from the rest of the galaxy. This was in large part due to the unmeasurable amount of knowledge gained from the Tau about the universe as a whole. However, regardless of their choices, the rest of the universe arrived with the return of the Imperium of Man. Seeing the inclusion and incorporation of the Xenos, the Imperium attacked without hesitation. In much the same fashion as the Tau some centuries ago, the initial invasion failed. The new enemy, however, had something different, something the Novae found difficult to combat. What the Imperium of Man brought were Astartes. Towering over the Novae warriors even in many of their mechs or adopted battlesuits, the Astartes fought with the fury of their emperor. The Space Marines from the Patriae Imperialis chapter launched a deadly counterattack that stumbled the Novae to their heels. The initial push was crushing, forcing many Novae into a fighting withdrawal. Their lines collapsing, the Novae warriors fell back to their air-filled strongholds. Despite putting up a fierce and bloody resistance, scoring many kills against the Astartes Patriae, it was not enough. Seeing no other alternative, the Rex Bellator and the Novae warriors abandoned their last lines of defense. Taking as much as they could, the remaining Novae evacuated the planet, boarding the converted Tau ships in orbit opposite the Imperial fleet. In a devastating loss, the Novae ships managed to fight their way through the blockade, fleeing the system, their honor forever stained. What's left of the Novae culture now resides in a combat flotilla, seeking refuge when and where they can. While some felt betrayed by the Rex Bellator who gave the evacuation order, most agreed that their entire civilization would have been lost had they not. Some have even questioned the decision to fight the Imperium to begin with, claiming they should still have their home if they joined them instead. Often turning to piracy to acquire needed supplies, the Novae warriors became a nomadic culture. Besides piracy, the Novae also sell their services to planets in need of unaffiliated mercenary army. As time progressed, the Novae began accepting and indoctrinating other species into their ranks from other displaced cultures or societies. The Eldari were a welcome addition to replenish their ranks, especially as close combat and stealth specialists. But many other species were included. Beastmen, Felinid, Neandor, Ogryn, Ratlings, Longsharks, Squats, Pelaga, and even Jokairo were incorporated, enhancing more than manpower. Weapons and equipment of numerous types were easily adopted. There was even an attempt to incorporate a group of Orc. It ultimately proved to be a fatal mistake for the liaison. After receiving so many other races and factions into their ranks, along with their new nomadic lifestyle, the warriors of the Novi could no longer consider themselves settlers. It was decided by the Rex Bellator that to better represent all those who have sacrificed for the flotilla, they would be given a proper nomenclature. As many of the indoctrinated would have surely perished if not for the warriors of the flotilla, they were often seen as being redeemed from their former lives. From then on, the members of the fleet would be forever known as the Redeemers' Conclave. This practice of savior and adoption allowed the Redeemers to not only replenish much of their lost warriors, but grow in faction size. With each new species added to their ranks, the sophistication, knowledge, and martial skill increased. While the Redeemers found it easier working with segments of the Tau and Eldari empires, they would not turn down desperate forces of the Imperium who have been otherwise abandoned by their own. If the job paid well, usually in supplies or other valuable resources and commodities, the Redeemers would contact with segment of the Imperium, albeit with modifications to their own force structure. This modification usually sees those of the Conclave who cannot pass as human or abhuman remaining behind with the flotilla or assigned to other combat duties that refrain from direct contact with Imperials. Depending on the will of the current Rex Bellator, the Conclave has also been known to come to the defense of Xenos planets against the Imperium, fighting as long as their resources hold or enemy reinforcements arrive. If the battle is lost, the Redeemers willing save what Xenos members they can and seek ways to fold them into the Conclave. Those that are unwilling to adapt or join the Redeemers have been at times spaced as cowards and not worthy of inclusion. This practice is rare, however. Despite no longer having a planet full of resources to manage the Novi, now Redeemer nomads decided to continue the tradition of the contest resplendent. However, with their plight inverted and manpower now the scarcity, the contest became non-lethal. Locations for the contest are randomly chosen based on the position of the flotilla, which provides the Redeemers with a variety of environments to practice their skills. However, Rex Bellator is still chosen through live combat of the last two contestants from the contest resplendent. With each succession, the Rex Bellator makes a vow to end the exodus from their home, and that they cannot be fully redeemed until they can retake their planet from those of the Imperium. This vow is both to ensure a glorious goal for all to seek, but serves also as a staunch reminder of what they have lost and by whom it was lost to. In addition to the vow of return, the Redeemer Conclave places an especially high honor to any of their warriors who can best an Astartes in personal combat, often gaining more than valuables and renown, but rank and tithing also follow. If the Astartes slain is also a brother to the Patria Imperialis, then the Redeemer who slayed him gets to directly challenge the current Rex Bellator in single combat, without having to wait for the contest. Currently, the Redeemer Conclave uses many methods to traverse the galaxy. With the help of the varied included species, they have access to not only FTL drives, but the Eldar webway and some warp capabilities. However, this is limited due to a lack of psychic-capable members that can navigate it. Given their limited manpower compared to other factions, however, the Conclave generally avoids highly contested areas, mostly consisting of Imperium or Chaos-controlled space. When piracy is needed, the Conclave generally targets shipping vessels or manufacturing planets and only raid enough to acquire the needed supplies. Recently, the Redeemers have been responding to an increase in distress calls from planets in the Segmentum Tempestus. Upon arrival, the planet's governments have been requesting assistance with full-scale evacuations to other systems further into the Segmentum. Contract reports have stated that these planets had requested evacuation due to advanced warning of an imminent invasion of a reportedly unstoppable xenospecies. However, no such threat has been witnessed by the flotilla. As the evacuations are contracted, they are carried out regardless of any danger present. However, there have been several forward advance squadrons to have gone MIA in the sector as well, but there is no evidence to suggest the two are connected. At this time, the Redeemer Conclave has been operating near the border of the Eastern Fringe in the Ultima Segmentum, but have been previously recorded in various other sectors across the galaxy. However, those reports are merely rumor, as it is difficult to identify the real Redeemer flotilla due to the inclusion of so many different ships and their means of travel across the galaxy.